Doctor Who may have started as a children's show in 1963, but over time it evolved, diving headfirst into darker themes, suspense, and even horror, pushing the boundaries of what family television could be. The Fourth Doctor's era in particular flirted with terror and gore, so much so that it drew criticism and eventually led to a softening of the show's tone. Yet, Doctor Who couldn't resist its darker impulses, and as the 1980s brought a bolder, more radical approach to TV, Doctor Who followed suit. Of all the grim stories Doctor Who has told, none hit quite as hard as Resurrection of the Daleks. A story soaked in violence, death, and unrelenting despair. It's unforgettable for all the right and wrong reasons. So join me as we dive into this harrowing tale, exploring how the Doctor, Tegan, Turlough, the Daleks, and the merciless Lytton all contribute to the bleakness of this unforgettable story. Resurrection of the Daleks may be bleak, but that's part of its appeal. The darkness draws you in. The story has its highs and lows, but Matthew Robinson's direction is crucial to its impact, especially in the first 5 minutes. Right from the start, we're plunged into a grim atmosphere that sets the tone for everything that follows. The opening takes us to the gloomy, rain-soaked warehouses of Shad Thames. An elderly man, quietly preparing a cigarette, suddenly finds himself witnessing a chaotic escape. Prisoners in futuristic garb, fleeing from armed men dressed as police officers. What happens next is truly shocking. The officers ruthlessly gun down all but 2 of the prisoners and the elderly witness, before their leader, Lytton, disappears with the bodies and the weapons. For a Dalek story, this is far from what you would expect. Daleks normally don't make an appearance until the end of the first episode in classic Doctor Who, but here you might have expected them to be in pursuit of the escaped prisoners. The spotlight instead falls upon these sinister police officers. As viewers, we're conditioned to see police as figures of authority and protection, but here they're cold-blooded killers, mowing down a group of desperate, seemingly innocent people. This bleak, rain-soaked setting, and the violence that unfolds without a Dalek in sight, sets the stage for a story that's far darker and more complex than a typical Doctor Who adventure. The warehouses continue to dominate the narrative, serving as one of the primary settings of the story, while the other is a grim space prison holding just one inmate, Davros. Typically, Doctor Who space stations are sleek, sterile and futuristic, but this prison subverts all expectations. It's decaying, malfunctioning, and riddled with neglect. The crew, just as worn down as their surroundings, are trapped in a thankless job, resigned to their dismal fate. The bleakness quickly escalates when a Dalek battlecruiser launches an assault on the prison. In a ruthless and coordinated attack, Lytton and his mercenaries storm the facility, slaughtering most of the crew and taking over. It's a brutal turning point that merges these two contrasting settings, the rundown warehouses of Earth and the crumbling prison in space. Despite their differences, both are drenched in a sense of hopelessness, reinforcing the grim direction this story is heading. The title, Resurrection of the Daleks, signals the Daleks' desperate attempt at a comeback, with their primary goal being to free Davros from his imprisonment. Their alliance with Lytton and his mercenaries show just how far they've fallen, a decline confirmed by their crushing defeat in the war against the Movellans, who we first encountered in 1979's Destiny of the Daleks. This brings us to the fascinating connection between the grim warehouses in London and the futuristic space station. The warehouses contain samples of the Movellan virus, the very weapon that devastated the Daleks, while the time corridor physically links these two settings. The corridor also ensnares the TARDIS, dragging the Doctor, Tegan and Turlough into the chaos. They soon encounter Stein, the now sole surviving prisoner from the story's opening scene, and a team of soldiers investigating the virus canisters. What follows is a relentless sequence of events: clashes with Daleks, Tegan injured in a crossfire, and Turlough accidentally transported to the Dalek ship through the time corridor. It's a suspenseful, atmospheric rollercoaster that keeps the tension high. But from here the plot seems to spiral. The narrative becomes tangled with subplots, adding layers of complexity, sometimes to the story's detriment. One key addition is the concept of Dalek duplicates, exterminated humans copied into loyal agents of the Daleks, designed to carry out their secret missions. The stakes are raised when the Daleks plan to duplicate the Doctor, Tegan and Turlough and have them infiltrate and assassinate the High Council of Gallifrey. Though compelling on its own, this subplot feels crammed into an already packed narrative. On top of that, the seeds of a Dalek civil war begin to sprout. Davros, now feeling betrayed and sidelined by his own creations, starts plotting to engineer a new race of Daleks loyal to him alone, whilst the Daleks themselves plan to eliminate him once he finds a way to make them immune to the Magellan virus. With all these subplots in play, Resurrection of the Daleks becomes a whirlwind of conflicting agendas. The Doctor finds himself darting between earthbound warehouses and the space setting, battling Daleks, reuniting with Davros, and confronting the duplicates sent to retrieve the virus samples. Meanwhile, the remaining prison crew, now a ragtag resistance, fight back against Lytton and his mercenaries as they plot to destroy the prison from within. The result is a story bursting at the seams, teetering between gripping suspense and overwhelming chaos. Resurrection of the Daleks was penned by Eric Saywood, who was also serving as the show's script editor at the time. This was his third contribution as a writer, following 1982's The Visitation and the iconic Earthshock. Many of the narrative techniques and dark themes he explored in Earthshock are revisited and cranked up in Resurrection of the Daleks. Both stories mark the return of classic antagonists after a long absence, plunging them into grimmer, more violent scenarios compared to their previous outings. The show is split between Earth and space settings, are notorious for their high body counts and relentless violence, leaving few survivors by the story's conclusions. However, in Resurrection of the Daleks, Saywood introduces a new narrative device that would become a staple for the remainder of his tenure as script editor: the presence of mercenary characters who play a significant role in the story, despite not being the primary villains. Enter Lytton, who makes a memorable first impression during the brutal opening scene where the disguised policemen massacre the group of prisoners. Aligned with the Daleks but unafraid to question their decisions, especially their choice to free Davros, Lytton brings a ruthless, calculating presence to the narrative. His mercenaries take centre stage in action sequences, often stepping in for the Daleks to deliver intense moments that push the story's tension. This approach compensates for the physical limitations of the Dalek props, elevating the shock factor and amplifying the story's sense of peril. Resurrection of the Daleks serves as a pivotal moment in Doctor Who, acting both as the beginning of the end for the Fifth Doctor era and a harbinger for the darker, more violent tone that would define the upcoming Sixth Doctor era. By the story's conclusion, we witness the emotional departure of long-serving companion Tegan, shaken by the relentless violence and death she has endured. In a heartbreaking moment, she admits that travelling in the TARDIS is no longer fun, a powerful statement that reflects the story's grim atmosphere. The next adventure, Planet of Fire, continue this trend with Turlough's departure and the introduction of Perry, who would go on to be a key companion during the Sixth Doctor's turbulent tenure, before we end up on the Fifth Doctor's iconic swan song, The Cares of Androzani. The legacy of Resurrection of the Daleks stretches beyond this story. Lytton, the mercenary who survives the carnage, returns in Attack of the Cybermen the following season. In that story, we get to see more of his morally complex character. Meanwhile, Davros's desire to create a new race of Daleks loyal only to him continues to unfold in Revelation of the Daleks, where his twisted ambitions have finally borne fruit. The resulting schism between Davros's Daleks and the original faction ignites a civil war, deepening the rift, setting the stage for further conflict. The dark, violent undertones of Resurrection of the Daleks will become defining features of the Sixth Doctor era, with stories like Attack of the Cybermen, Vengeance on Varos, and Revelation of the Daleks, all embracing grim narrative and graphic depictions of death. This era, often criticised for its brutality and pessimism, took the bleak themes explored in Resurrection and Daleks and amplified them, resulting in one of the most controversial chapters in Doctor Who's history. Resurrection of the Daleks is grim, bleak, and unforgiving, but that's not a critique. It's what makes this story so compelling. Its downbeat tone serves as a stark reminder that the Doctor doesn't always have the power to fix everything, even when his intentions are pure. The Fifth Doctor's compassionate and vulnerable nature contrasts sharply with the story's harsh environment, leaving him grappling with moral dilemmas that push him to his limits, most notably when he decides to go up against his principles and attempt to execute Davros. This isn't a one-off moment, though. The Doctor, usually a staunch opponent of firearms, is seen holding Davros at gunpoint and even fires a handgun at a Dalek mutant. The bleak atmosphere of the story doesn't just affect its narrative, but profoundly impacts the Doctor himself. Tegan, too, is deeply affected by the senseless violence around her. Though she spends much of the story in the warehouses, she bears witness to the cold-blooded killings that ultimately drive her to leave the TARDIS, admitting that the adventure has lost its joy. The sheer on-screen death toll of Resurrection of the Daleks, often cited as the highest in Doctor Who history, with estimates ranging from 30 to 70 victims, underlines the brutality of the Daleks, Davros, and their merciless allies, restoring a fear factor that had been missing in some of the previous outings. The story also shines thanks to the outstanding performances of its guest cast. Terry Malloy effortlessly embodies Davros, channeling his character's manipulative and treacherous nature, even when dealing with his own creations. Maurice Colburn's portrayal of Lytton adds layers of depth, turning him into a cold, calculating antagonist with his own hidden agenda. Meanwhile, Rodney Bewes, best known for his comedic role in The Lightly Lads, brings unexpected complexity to Stein, shifting him between vulnerable and duplicitous, with a stammer that hints at his divided nature. However, Resurrection of the Daleks isn't without its flaws. While Eric Saywood deserves credit for crafting such a dark and intense narrative, the story suffers from trying to juggle too many plot lines within the 90-minute runtime. The Daleks' mission to free and manipulate Davros is compelling enough, but the added subplot involving their plan to assassinate the High Councillor Gallifrey through duplicates feels extraneous, cluttering the narrative and taking valuable screen time away from the main story. It's a prime example of how sometimes less is more. The overabundance of subplots means many intriguing ideas don't get the development they deserve, often feeling rushed, condensed, or ultimately unfulfilled. Key characters lack significant interactions with one another, and the Doctor's confrontation with Davros is brief and comes late on, whilst Lytton, one of the story's standout characters, barely shares any screen time with the Doctor, missing a golden opportunity for a dynamic encounter. Saywood would repeat this narrative overstuffing in the Sixth Doctor's Attack of the Cybermen, co-written under a pseudonym, where he tried to tie up loose ends from previous Cybermen stories whilst also expanding Lytton's character. However, there's a sense that Saywood recognised the shortcomings of Resurrection of the Daleks and sought to refine his approach with Revelation of the Daleks. The latter's more straightforward narrative, though primarily a Davros story rather than a Dalek one, shows Saywood's attempt to strike a better balance, focusing on tighter storytelling without losing the dark, brooding atmosphere that defined his earlier works. In the end, Resurrection of the Daleks stands as a bold, albeit flawed chapter in Doctor Who's history, a tale that fearlessly delves into the darker corners of the Doctor's universe, reminding us that sometimes even the brightest heroes must navigate the shadows. But tell me, what do you think of Resurrection of the Daleks? Maybe you think it's the perfect Dalek story. Perhaps the bleakness and violence is too much. Perhaps you feel it's too much of a missed opportunity. But do let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.